Let me preface this by saying that I absolutely hate going to the DMV. It's a universally despised chore, the kind of thing you put off until the last possible moment. For me, that moment came last Thursday when I realized my driver's license had expired 2 weeks prior. I couldn't put it off any longer, so I dragged myself out of bed early and headed to the closest DMV branch. Little did I know, that seemingly ordinary day would unfold into something straight out of a movie. I arrived at the DMV around 8:30 a.m., hoping to beat the crowd. Spoiler, I didn't. The line already snaked out the door, a testament to the universal truth that DMV lines defy all logic and planning. As I settled into my spot, mentally preparing for hours of waiting, I heard someone behind me say, "No way, it's really you?" I turned around and froze. It was Dan, my best friend from high school. We hadn't seen each other in over a decade. Back then, we were inseparable, playing in a garage band, sneaking out to midnight movies, and dreaming about taking on the world. But life happened. College, jobs, relationships. We drifted apart without any particular falling out. Seeing him there, in such a mundane setting, felt surreal. Dan looked almost the same as he had in high school, just with a few grey hairs and a slightly more polished demeanor. We started talking, and before I knew it, the line felt like it was moving faster, though it wasn't. He told me he was in town for a few days to help his parents move and had stopped by the DMV to sort out some paperwork. I filled him in on my less than thrilling job as a sales manager and my recent decision to take up photography as a hobby. We laughed about old times, and for a brief moment, it felt like no time had passed. After what felt like an eternity, my number was finally called. Dan and I exchanged numbers, promising to grab a drink later that evening. I thought that would be the highlight of my day. I was wrong. Inside the DMV, chaos reigned. The system had gone down, and a wave of frustration rippled through the room. People were sighing, pacing, and calling their bosses to explain why they'd be late. I sat there, trying to stay calm, when I noticed a young woman struggling with a stroller near the entrance. Her toddler was screaming, and she looked completely overwhelmed. Without thinking, I got up and offered to help. She hesitated at first, but the desperation in her eyes must have outweighed her skepticism. I entertained the toddler with some goofy faces while she sorted out her paperwork. When she finished, she thanked me profusely and said, "You have no idea how much I needed that." We ended up chatting for a while. Her name was Emily, and she was a single mom trying to balance work, parenting, and school. Her car had broken down the day before, and she'd come to the DMV to renew her registration, hoping to avoid late fees. She seemed genuinely kind, and I found myself admiring her resilience. Before she left, she handed me a piece of paper with her contact info, saying, "If you ever want to grab coffee, let me know." It's rare to meet genuinely nice people these days. As if my day wasn't already eventful enough, the final twist came when I left the DMV. I noticed an older man struggling to change a flat tire in the parking lot. He looked like he'd been at it for a while, sweat dripping down his face. I walked over and offered to help. Together, we managed to get the spare tire on in about 15 minutes. As he packed up his tools, he handed me a crisp $20 bill. I tried to refuse, but he insisted, saying, "It's not about the money. It's about showing gratitude. You reminded me there are still good people out there." By the time I got back to my car, I was exhausted but oddly energized. That evening, I met up with Dan for drinks, and we spent hours reminiscing and catching up. He told me about his struggles with his career and how he was considering a major life change. I shared my own doubts and aspirations, and by the end of the night, we both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, I texted Emily and asked if she'd like to grab that coffee. She said yes. We met at a small cafe downtown and talked for hours. Turns out, we had more in common than I'd expected. That was the start of something new, something I'm cautiously optimistic about. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much happened in just one day. A chance reunion, a moment of kindness, and a reminder that even in the most mundane places, life has a way of surprising you. I used to think of the DMV as a symbol of bureaucracy and frustration. Now, it's the place where my life took an unexpected turn. Second story. It all started with a GPS error. I was on a solo road trip, driving from Chicago to Denver, hoping to clear my head after a messy breakup and some work stress. The plan was simple: stick to the interstate, blast my favorite playlists, and avoid overthinking. But somewhere in Iowa, my GPS recalculated, rerouted, and sent me down a series of increasingly narrower roads. By the time I realized the mistake, I was deep into the countryside, miles away from any recognizable highway. I considered turning back, but then I saw a sign for a small town called Willow Creek, population 872. Curiosity won over frustration, and I decided to take a break there, grab some coffee, and figure out where I went wrong. I didn't expect much, just a few gas stations and maybe a diner. But as I drove into town, I felt like I'd stepped into a postcard. Willow Creek was charming in a way that felt almost frozen in time. There was a main street lined with red brick buildings, a small park with kids playing on swings, and an old-fashioned general store with a hand-painted sign that read Henry Supply Company, estimated 1927. I parked my car in front of the diner, aptly named Marge's Cafe, and stepped inside, the bell on the door jingling behind me. The place was cozy, with checkered tablecloths, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated in what looked like years. A cheerful older woman, Marge herself, as I would later learn, greeted me and poured me a cup of coffee without even asking. "You look like you've been driving a while," she said with a knowing smile. I nodded, too tired to explain the whole GPS debacle. While I waited for my sandwich, a man sitting at the counter struck up a conversation. His name was Joe, a retired mechanic who seemed to know everyone in town. He asked what brought me to Willow Creek, and when I told him about the wrong turn, he chuckled and said, "Funny how life works, huh? Sometimes the wrong turn is the right one." At the time, I didn't think much of it, but those words would stick with me. Joe ended up inviting me to check out a local event happening that evening, a community barbecue at the park. Normally, I would have declined, eager to get back on the road, but something about Willow Creek made me want to stay. I figured I'd spend an hour or two, then head out. The barbecue was unlike anything I'd experienced before. The entire town seemed to be there, laughing, eating, and sharing stories. Joe introduced me to a few people, including a woman named Claire, who ran the town's bookstore. We talked for what felt like hours about everything from literature to life in small towns. She told me how she'd moved to Willow Creek from New York City after burning out from the corporate grind. "I thought I was giving up on life," she said, "but really, I was just starting to live." At some point, the mayor, a jovial man in his 70s, got up to make a speech, thanking everyone for coming and reminding them about the town's annual cleanup day next weekend. The sense of community was palpable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I ended up staying in Willow Creek for 2 days. Joe let me crash at his place, insisting that no one paid for a motel when they were in his town. Over those 2 days, I learned more about the people of Willow Creek and their stories. There was Henry, the owner of the general store, who had inherited it from his grandfather. There was Marge, who had been running her cafe for 40 years and knew everyone's coffee order by heart. And there was Claire, whose quiet strength and passion for books left a lasting impression on me. Leaving Willow Creek was harder than I expected. As I drove back to the interstate, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversations I'd had and the lessons I'd learned. Joe's words echoed in my mind, "Sometimes the wrong turn is the right one." That wrong turn had led me to a place where people genuinely cared for one another, where life moved at a slower, more intentional pace. It's been a year since that trip, and a lot has changed. I've started making time for the things that matter, calling my friends more often, taking up photography again, and even volunteering at a local community center. And every now and then, I find myself wondering how the folks in Willow Creek are doing. Maybe one day, I'll take another road trip and see where the detours lead me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life's most meaningful moments often come when you least expect them. Third story. I've always believed life is a mix of choices and chance. But what happened to me last year still feels like fate had its hand on the wheel. It all started with a business trip, a mundane 3-day visit to Seattle to meet with a client. I wasn't particularly excited about it. Work trips are usually the same: rushed schedules, generic hotel rooms, and too many hours sitting in conference rooms. But this trip turned out to be anything but ordinary. It was late on a Thursday evening when I landed at SeaTac Airport. My flight had been delayed, and by the time I got to my rental car, I was starving. I spotted a roadside diner a few miles from my hotel and decided to grab a quick bite. The place was classic Americana, red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a waitress who called everyone hun. As I sat there waiting for my burger, I reached into my pocket and felt something unfamiliar. Pulling it out, I realized it was an old keychain, a small, worn leather tag with the initials JT embossed on it. I hadn't seen it in years and had no idea how it ended up in my pocket. Then it hit me: it was from my childhood best friend, Jake. Jake and I grew up together in a small town in Ohio. We were inseparable through elementary and middle school, the kind of friendship that felt like it would last forever. But life had other plans. His family moved to the West Coast when we were 14, and despite a few letters and phone calls, we eventually lost touch. I hadn't thought about Jake in years, but holding that keychain brought back a flood of memories. I spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about our adventures, building forts in the woods, riding our bikes until sunset, and sneaking into the local swimming pool after hours. By the time I got back to my hotel, I was smiling at the thought of those simpler times. The next day, I had a packed schedule. Meetings stretched longer than expected, and by the time I was done, I was too exhausted to do much else. I grabbed dinner at the hotel and decided to call it a night. As I was about to turn off the light, I checked my phone and saw a notification, a missed call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something compelled me to call back. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. "Hey, is this Alex?" the man asked hesitantly. When I confirmed, he laughed. "It's Jake. Jake Thompson." I froze. How could this be possible? Jake explained that he'd found my number through a mutual friend from our hometown, who'd mentioned I was in Seattle for work. "I live just outside the city," he said. "If you're free tomorrow, I'd love to catch up." The next day, we met at a coffee shop downtown. I hardly recognized him at first. He was taller, with a beard and a few gray hairs, but his smile was the same. We spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of the last 2 decades. Jake had become a high school teacher and was married with 2 kids. He told me about his struggles and triumphs, and I shared mine. It felt like no time had passed, yet we were also so different from the kids we once were. As we talked, I realized how much I'd missed having Jake in my life. He reminded me of a part of myself I'd almost forgotten, the adventurous, carefree kid who believed anything was possible. He even remembered the keychain, laughing when I showed it to him. "I can't believe you kept this," he said, shaking his head. "I thought you'd have tossed it years ago." That afternoon, Jake took me to his home, where I met his family. His wife, Emily, was warm and welcoming, and his kids were adorable. It was surreal seeing this whole other side of his life, but it also made me happy to see how far he'd come. Before I left Seattle, Jake and I made a pact to stay in touch this time. We exchanged numbers, added each other on social media, and even planned a visit for the following summer. As I boarded my flight home, I couldn't help but marvel at the series of events that had brought us back together: a forgotten keychain, a random phone call, and a chance business trip. It's been a year since that reunion, and Jake and I have kept our promise. We talk regularly, and I've even visited him a couple more times. Reconnecting with him reminded me of the importance of cherishing the people who shaped us, even if life pulls us apart for a while. Sometimes, the past has a way of finding us when we least expect it, and when it does, it's a gift worth holding on to.